My guest at this time is Andrew C. McCarthy. He is a former federal prosecutor, former chief assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. He's also a contributing editor and columnist at National Review Online and a Fox News Channel contributor. He's joined us at many different stages of the Mueller investigation into the 2016 elections, what Russia was doing, whether or not there was any collusion, whether or not there was any obstruction of justice. The Mueller report says no collusion and did not reach a conclusion on obstruction of justice. But Bob Mueller officially resigning as special counsel today, but not before making a public statement at the Justice Department, where he uttered a couple of things that give a lot of fuel to both sides of the politics of the Russia investigation. First of all, he said this about the report itself.
But beyond these few remarks, it is important that the office's written work speak for itself.
Which had the president and his allies saying, we already know what's in the report, so essentially Mueller didn't have anything new to say. Democrats say he did, mainly this.
If we had had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so. We did not, however, make a determination as to whether the president did commit a crime. The introduction to the Volume 2 of our report explains that decision. It explains that under long-standing department policy, a president cannot be charged with a federal crime while he is in office. That is unconstitutional. Even if the charge is kept under seal and hidden from public view, that too is prohibited.
So now you've got a lot of Democrats, particularly a lot of presidential candidates, calling for impeachment hearings. Some are holding their powder just a little bit off of that, like Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi and Jerry Nadler, the latter two who will be very important in this whole process. So, Andy, first of all, thanks for being with us. And secondly, the big question in my mind as we get started here is, I think I remember Bill Barr saying that the Justice Department policy was not the reason there was no conclusion for obstruction of justice when it came to the president, but Bob Mueller at least seemed to be intimating something different today. What's the reality here?
Well, I think that oddly enough, both things are true. Even though they seem like they're in conflict. And the only way that we can unwind them, Greg, I think, is to look at what the timeline says. So my impression, just so you know where I'm going with this, is I think that Mueller probably decided at the last minute to rely on the OLC guidance. That's the Office of Legal Counsel guidance that says a sitting president may not be indicted. I think what happened here is Barr and Mueller first met on March 5th after Barr was confirmed, and they had their first basic meeting about what was, status of the investigation. And it was at that meeting that Mueller first alerted the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General, and others that he was not going to make a decision about obstruction. And I think it was at that point that Barr asked him, and he said that Mueller was emphatic on this, whether the OLC guidance was the rationale for not making a decision. And Mueller evidently said no, that was not the reason. And when he was asked, well, what is the reason? He said that they were still formulating their rationale. And then fast forward 2.5 weeks later, he files his report, and it turns out that he decided to rely on the OLC guidance. So I think what Barr said it was accurate in the time that he said it, but obviously at the time that Mueller filed his report, he had altered his position or developed it fully, or however you want to put it.
And Andy, you've written a book on impeachment, and you explain very well in that book how impeachment is not a legal process, it's a political process. So to what extent do you think Mueller was telling Congress, here, I've teed you up here, take it from here? Because some people on the left certainly seem to see it that way, while others on the right don't see it that way at all.
Well, I see it the way they see it on the left, then, I guess, if that's that's our framework for analyzing this. Look, I think here's what he says in essence. If you boil it down, if I had found no prosecutable crime, I would have said so. I didn't say so. I couldn't indict because of the OLC guidance, And in this system, it's up to Congress, not federal prosecutors, to address presidential misconduct. I think if you put that all together, it makes it a lot stronger, this argument that we've heard since, in the 6 or 8 weeks or whatever it's been since Mueller filed his report, that he was basically throwing the ball into Congress's court. I've poo-pooed that argument, to be honest, because I actually have always thought, it was Congress has the last word on this, whether a prosecutor likes it or not, because Congress doesn't need an indictable offense in order to impeach. And an impeachable offense, high crimes and misdemeanors, are not necessarily, felonies under the federal penal code. And because Congress can indict or Congress can impeach on anything that it thinks is a sufficiently egregious abuse of power that impeachment is warranted, Congress was always going to get to look at Mueller's report, no matter what Mueller thought of it, and they could decide to do with it what they would. So I've always thought that whole thing was, kind of beside the point. But I think today, Greg, he really seemed to me, he doesn't want to testify, but he did give Democrats as much as they could hope for from his testimony, I think, by saying, if I had thought there was no crime here, I would have said so, and it's up to you Democrats who run Congress to decide what to do about it.
What do you make of his rationale here? I remember when the report first came out, you were frustrated that he didn't make a call on obstruction, but now he's relying on the OLC guidance. So does his decision make more sense now, or does it still frustrate you? No,
it still frustrates me because he really didn't say anything. He was more pointed and succinct and coherent, I thought, in making the explanation today than what's in the report, which is, would hurt your head. And I had to read about 5 times, I thought, before I could understand it. But the fact that what he said today was more succinct and coherent didn't mean that it was any more persuasive. I think it's ridiculous to claim that the question whether there was sufficient evidence to charge, which was what his obligation was to decide as the prosecutor who was responsible for the investigation, to say that decision can't be made separate from the OLC guidance about whether you indict or not while the president is sitting is just absurd. They're two different questions. And what should happen here is the prosecutor who's responsible for the case makes a decision about whether or not there is enough evidence to charge. And then you bring that to your supervisor, in this case, the Attorney General. And the Attorney General would then have 2 decisions to make. One, do I go along, do I agree with my subordinates finding that there's enough evidence to charge? And 2, are there policies like the OLC guidance that ought to be invoked here that mean that we can't return an indictment? But that's a totally separate question from whether there's enough evidence to charge. And I think Mueller is using it to try to rationalize not making the only decision that he was needed to make, which is, was there a chargeable case here or not on the question of obstruction?
Andy, this issue, of course, came up today on our 3 Martini Lunch podcast that I co-host with our mutual friend Jim Garrity. And Jim was saying that, first of all, not being able to exonerate doesn't mean guilt necessarily, of course. But he also said that when you look at what's in that part of the Mueller report, that perhaps trying to break the law but failing doesn't necessarily mean guilt either, because you've got Trump in a fit at one point ordering Don McGahn to fire Mueller, which he just doesn't do, and other things along the way which he ordered people to do, but they didn't actually do because they knew it would be even more troublesome for him. So is there there could obviously be political culpability there, but is there legal culpability for being a person with bad intent but doesn't actually do it?
Yeah, well, there's a few things there, Greg, that are relevant. I mean, first of all, obstruction is one of these crimes like conspiracy that doesn't have to be successful in order to be prosecutable. So, for example, if I'm on trial and I offer one of the jurors, $10,000 to vote not guilty, and the juror doesn't take the bribe, I've still obstructed justice, even though I didn't succeed, right? So the obstruction statute says endeavors to, corruptly do the things that you are not allowed to do under the obstruction statute. The complication here is with the president. The president is one of the few officials in our system who actually is allowed legally to influence a proceeding. The president can, at the front end of a proceeding, a president can say, I don't want that investigated. At the back end, he can pardon. All prosecutorial power, all investigative power in the federal government comes from the president. So the president is actually allowed to impact investigations in a way that it's constitutional for him in a way that it wouldn't be a legal defense for most of us. The other thing is to try to cite the president for obstruction for attempting to fire someone is ridiculous because he's the president. And what I mean by that, Greg, is if you and I decide to rob the First National Bank, we can give it our best shot, but the outcome is not in our control, right? The president, on the other hand, is totally in control of firing subordinates or not. The president never attempts to fire anybody. He either fires them or he doesn't. So factually, it's hard to make a case out on a president for attempting to fire the special counsel, for example, or attempting to direct the attorney general to reverse his recusal. Because if he wanted to do that, ultimately, he could have done it. And the fact that his subordinates talked him out of it is what subordinates are supposed to do. So, I think the fact that this is the president complicates things a lot. And the other thing, Greg, that really needs to be worked out that has been kind of sidestepped around, but I think now probably has to get confronted, is Barr, the Attorney General, and Special Counsel Mueller, I think, have very different ideas about what constitutes potentially obstructive behavior. I think Barr's position is to obstruct, you have to do the traditional corrupt acts that you think of with obstruction, tampering with witnesses, destroying evidence, and the like. Mueller has a much broader view, which says that even if a president is acting in a legitimate exercise of his constitutional authority, like firing a subordinate, he can still be cited for obstruction if a prosecutor decides that he was improperly motivated in taking that ostensibly lawful step. I think Barr would disagree with that. Now, Barr tried to make the legal issue go away by saying, I don't agree with Mueller's take on obstruction, but even if we adopt his framework, in any case, a prosecutor would have to prove corrupt intent beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think on the facts of this case, you could never prove corrupt intent beyond a reasonable doubt because the president cooperated with the investigation. He made a lot of evidence available to the investigators that he didn't have to. He could have shut the investigation down. He never did. And therefore, I don't think any jury would ever find that he had a corrupt intent beyond a reasonable doubt. Mueller, I think, has taken a different position on that. I think he's saying he thinks there's enough evidence there that a rational jury, not saying that they necessarily would, but that they could find corrupt intent. So I really think at this point we have to get straight from the Justice Department what is an impeachable offense. What is the Office of Legal Counsel, not an impeachable offense, I'm sorry, an obstruction offense. What does the Office of Legal Counsel think is the correct standard for potentially impeachable conduct committed by a president? That's really got to be resolved, I think.
Wow. Well, we've already gone far too long here, Andy. You've been very generous with your time. Sometime soon, I also want to get your thoughts on what Mueller's had to say about Russian attempts to legitimately interfere in this election. That seems to be the one issue that Mueller stressed more than any other, and the one that both parties are least interested in addressing today.
Yeah, right. Who cares about Russia? We got Trump.
That's right. Now we've got everybody's licking their chops over a possible impeachment battle, and it sounds like Trump wants it almost as much as some of the Democrats do. So buckle up. It's going to be an interesting stretch here.
When you can talk about George Papadopoulos, who wants to talk about Russia?
Andy, good to be with you as always. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Greg.
Andrew C. McCarthy is a former federal prosecutor, former chief assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, contributing editor at National Review Online, where he's also a columnist, and his columns on this investigation are absolute must-reading. He's also a Fox News Channel contributor. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.